The Sober Man by Elliot Chapman. Charles knocked 3 times on the door of Captain Hitchcock's room. He was distinctly uneasy as he waited for that officer's gruff bark to grant him entry. Although the captain, like Charles himself, was a young man, he had the advantage of a powerful, gravelly voice that buttressed his authority. Charles knew that it would take more than the outward symbols of rank to quell the cadets in North Barrack. It needed Hitchcock's formidable presence. It needed his voice. Hitchcock possessed the steel that would encourage the most rebellious cadets to back down and obey orders. Seconds that felt like days passed, and Charles raised his fist to knock again. He hesitated. Captain Hitchcock must have been roused already. It was likely he was investigating the commotion personally at this very moment. He would be putting the ringleaders back in their places while he, Charles, stood anxiously about a corridor, like a man uncertain how to proceed. He glanced down the passageway, which echoed with the rowdy voices of the young men on the upper floors. He could hear their songs and the stamping of their boots as they caroused. He could make out the din of their arguments as liquor agitated them into confrontations over petty issues. He knew his position as chaplain offered him some protection against their riotous behaviour. They were good, God-fearing boys at heart, but he was still unsettled by the magnitude of their disorder and how it had spread so rapidly through the academy compound. He swallowed with difficulty, his mouth dry, as ironic as that seemed in the circumstances. It was not the most auspicious start to Christmas. The truth was, it looked exceedingly bad for all of them. Once news got out that cadets had smuggled alcohol onto the campus, as he was sure it would once order was restored and the court-martials instigated, the honour of West Point would be greatly compromised. The chaplain found his hands pressed together, as if prayer was the only action available to him. He clenched his fists in sudden defiance. This was a situation that required him to be practical, not indulgent. It was true he might not exude the same confidence as Hitchcock, and he might not possess the same natural dominance over the men. For one, his voice was much smaller and lighter, trained to give spiritual guidance and solace. But he could do more than fret or pray for Captain Hitchcock to deliver them. Charles turned away from the captain's door and headed back down the passageway. It was high time the commandant was informed. There would be few rewards for trying to contain the crisis and keep the truth from Major Worth. Charles took a side door out of the main building. The ground beyond was almost frozen. Black bristles of grass, like so many dead spiders, crunched under his boots. His best chance of success was to stick close to the outside of the barrack buildings and try to navigate his way around the campus until he reached Major Worth's quarters. If the cadets had any lingering sense about them, they would continue their mutinous behaviour in the comparative warmth of the barracks and the mess room, leaving him unseen as he undertook his mission. Only the soft, flickering candlelight through the windows helped beat back the oppressive darkness hemming him in. Overhead, a cloudless sky was scattered with stars. Charles' breath hung in veils of mist around him, and there was the distinct smell of something burning on the breeze. He surveyed as much of the area as he could, but observed no signs of a fire. With caution, he set off. taking care not to slip on the patches of ice that had formed as the temperature had dropped even further. Charles had heard it rumoured that cadets Burnley, Roberts, and Centre had been responsible for some trouble at a local tavern only a few nights ago. Apparently, they had failed to return with a consignment of whisky and nearly got into a fight with the proprietor of that establishment in their attempt. There was also the view abroad that Cadet Jefferson Davis was the brains behind it all. That young man had become quite ill-disciplined of late, for all his potential as a young officer in the making, and he could well face serious repercussions for it, especially if he was discovered to have had a role in bringing a substantial amount of alcohol onto the campus, only 2 nights after the first attempt to do so had failed. The situation had rapidly slipped out of control, given the quantity of rum that had been secured and then distributed among so many of the cadets late on Christmas Eve. Charles wondered how they were going to save the reputation of the academy after such an overflow of Yuletide revelry. They were meant to be training an officer class of the highest discipline and code of honour. The consequences of this episode could besmirch the reputations of men like Superintendent Thayer, who had insisted on no alcohol on West Point at all, and Commandant Worth, irreparably. Charles' thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a sound, like a boot, crunching on the frozen ground behind him. He spun round and held his breath. Nothing. Just the 2 rows of barrack buildings that he was manoeuvring between. He could not see anything nor anyone beyond the 3rd building on each side of the pathway. There was only a square of intense blackness that the huts seemed to frame. Not such a surprising sight, given the lack of light at this hour. However, if someone were stood in that opaque square, they need only remain silent and still to avoid being caught. Eventually satisfied, he turned back, but quickly started as he noted someone on the path ahead of him. There was a man stood at the corner of a storehouse to his right. Clearly the sound of his movement had echoed off the surfaces of the other buildings and had confused Charles into thinking it had come from the rear. The silhouette did not move. Charles observed, however, that his head was tilted to the left at quite a curious angle. It was as if whoever the fellow was, he was studying the chaplain, almost like a dog might tilt its head to await instructions from its master. Charles decided to take the initiative and assume the man was a cadet. If he were mistaken, he was sure a well-meaning officer would forgive his audacity. "Where are you going, cadet?" There was no reply, at least not in the obvious sense. The cadet, or whoever he was, emitted a kind of low murmur in reply, which he followed with a peculiar rasping sound, as if something was stuck in his throat. Charles concluded he must be one of the revellers, too drunk to speak, and probably only out in the cold to purge some of the rum he had imbibed. "Report to the infirmary, cadet." The man fell silent. The choking sound came to an abrupt end, and he shuffled forward a little, a sign that he was willing to obey the chaplain's orders, at least. However, he continued to regard his superior in that curious, quite insubordinate way, with his head tilted to one side. Charles stood his ground as the cadet took a few more half-hearted steps forward. Then he appeared to slip on the ice, but regained his balance soon after. Charles, feeling a wave of impatience crash over him, stepped forward with the aim of helping the man on his way. He strode over to him, reached out his hand and took the cadet's wrist. It felt almost frozen. A weak light from the moon overhead threw a silvery beam on the drunken man's face. and Charles withdrew his hand in alarm. The cadet was quite blue, but not with cold. The shade was too dark and too deep. As Charles stared at him, he perceived a coil of thick rope around his neck. Traces of tar smeared on his tunic. The young man had either been involved in some violent altercation with his fellows, or a stupid practical joke had very nearly gone horribly wrong during their excess. "Who did this to you?" Charles demanded, pointing to the rope, which was, thankfully, not biting into the cadet's neck any longer, though it clearly had been, judging by the deep impressions in the thin flesh. The young man stared back at the chaplain, his eyes two great orbs of fiery intensity. He opened his mouth, and his voice came in a horrible, rasping croak. "Justice done on Webster Smith." As Charles stepped forward to assist the man, a great tongue of flame lit up the entire area, and he threw his body against the wall of the building behind him in fright. A scattering of small stones rained down on his head, and he glanced around, trying to find the injured cadet. Another explosion, and Charles fell. He could not quite believe what was happening. This was cannon fire. He scrambled to his knees, unable to locate the young man, but as his eyes focused on the darkness at the end of the path again, he was witness to a rapid series of explosions, as cannon roared and men's screams filled the air. "Good God!" he cried, pressing his body back into the barrack building once again, as the only shelter available to him. The screams of agony continued. Bugle horns, a great yelling of men like a chorus of wild yodeling. The smell of blood on the air. The din of musket fire. Charles was pinned down by it. West Point's men were killing each other, firing the parade ground cannon in a murderous frenzy. The chaplain curled his body into a ball and pressed his hands together in prayer. Men ran up the pathway, uniformed men with rifles and banners. They were fighting with the most vindictive savagery. Charles recoiled as a man with a gaping hole in his face staggered in front of him and collapsed in a bloody heap. He saw another with his head beaten to a fleshy pulp, and a third with his stomach spewing entrails from bayonet wounds. The roar of cannon continued unabated. The frenzy of the slaughter left him reeling. Charles saw it all. Boys fighting boys, though he could swear they carried themselves with the bearing of men, and battle-hardened ones at that. He cried out, as the men in unfamiliar uniforms fired on one another, releasing a great cloud of musket smoke. For a moment, Charles was lost in its miasma. He lost sight of the barbarous event, as if cocooned in a fine mist. A low murmur penetrated the veil. A rasping, choking voice reached his ears again, as a frozen hand parted the pall of musket smoke and took hold of his shoulder. He felt a deep, cold travel through the trapezius muscle and down into his back. He saw the strange tilted head bear down on him. The blue face turned black, as those protruding eyes bore into his. Like him, the man did not belong to the battle. Like him, he needed the very mist to escape into, to get away from an event in which he should have no part. Charles struggled against the frozen hand, crying out against the intense cold surging through his body as that mist thickened. "McIlvaine!" Captain Hitchcock had Charles gripped by the shoulders. A small detachment of cadets stood on guard behind him. "Captain," he replied, awestruck. "What happened, man?" Charles shook his head and steadied his breathing. He looked around, finding himself in the dawn's early light. "I was trying to reach the commandant." "The crisis is over," Hitchcock said plainly. Charles gazed at the captain, betraying confusion. "I fear someone must have discovered you. You have a slight head wound that will need taking care of." "My God, Ethan," Charles broke with formality and grabbed at the captain's sleeve. "They were killing each other." "It's all right, Charles." "So many." "Steady now." "I saw it." He pawed the captain's tunic. "Were they our boys, our cadets?" "It was just a few skirmishes, Charles," Hitchcock assured him. "Nothing more. No reports of any serious casualties." "For God's sake, Ethan." His voice was but a whisper now, as something in his mind clicked into place with devastating finality. Hitchcock's eyes narrowed, and he signalled for his cadets to help their chaplain to his feet where he might be tended by medics at the infirmary. "Ethan!" Charles cried as he was led away. Hitchcock watched as Charles McIlvaine was escorted from the vicinity. The man was overwrought. The events of Christmas Day at West Point had shocked him, as it had all of them. To have the men become a drunken rabble while in the confines of the academy itself? It was an intolerable situation. Their role was to unite against a common enemy, the outsider. They were to stand together for the honour of the Union, not fall into wanton disorder. Hitchcock sniffed and set his jaw. He was determined to restore discipline. The chaplain would recover with the rest, he was convinced of that. Christmas 1826 was not a date any of them were likely to forget. He only hoped the ramifications of what had occurred did not compromise their reputations too greatly. A few days later, and Charles McIlvaine was discharged from the infirmary, where he took it upon himself, as one of his first tasks, to study the roll of names of cadets currently at West Point. There was no Webster Smith among them. He gained permission to check the rolls of names from previous graduates, but to no avail. Websters, and Smiths certainly, but no Webster Smith. It was possible the man had given him the names of two others, perhaps the names of those who had hazed him, who had strung him up and damn near killed the poor fellow in their bacchanalian excess. But there remained one thing about the incident that Charles could not fathom. As the cadet's hand had come down through the gunsmoke, he could have sworn it was that of a Negro. The notion was quite impossible. Here, among the cadets in West Point, and yet neither that young man nor those he had seen in the carnage that had erupted around them had been of Charles McIlvaine's world at all, nor had they been of the same world as one another. 3 stars had come into perihelion. Something had ruptured and spewed out the justice to come for Charles Pettit McIlvaine to bear witness to.